Christine, the floor is yours. Professor Christine Parker, Melbourne University, on can labeling. Let's see, can labeling create holistic transformation of the food system? So Christine, thank you very much, and please go on.
Thanks, David. And I was going to ask Tess and John a question, which kind of comes at the end of my talk anyway, so we'll get there. I assume you can see my screen okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so greetings from Melbourne, Naarm, the stolen land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. So this presentation is based on a multi-year project on the politics of food labelling, and there's now a published paper which is really summarising the findings of the project, and I did upload that to the conference platform, so you can check that if you like. And there are a number of co-authors on the published paper that I want to acknowledge. So for the purposes of this panel today, I want to suggest that we could see food labels as regulatory intermediaries. And by that, I mean the labels themselves, the space themselves. So that is food labeling in the sense of all the marketing and information that accompanies items at the point of sale, on the packaging and on the marketing on the shelves or on the website if it's a retail sale. And that is in fact the legal definition of food labelling all around the world. So often when regulatory studies scholars talk about labelling, we're not really talking about the politics of labelling. We actually end up talking about the impact or lack of impact of ethical consumer action or voluntary certification schemes. But in this project, what we tried to do was draw on a more science and technology studies type take on food labelling to see the label itself as a governance space in its own right. So we see the label not just as an artifact of the interesting regulatory action that's happening somewhere else, although they do that, but they're also devices or actors in their own right. They act upon rather than merely represent the food supply chain behind a given food product, as Evans and Mueller said. They're designed to grab our attention, to influence our emotions, and to channel our ethics and politics. But they're also designed to work backwards to standardise and coordinate information back along the supply chain, and as between different producers, so they can create or close off markets, create new market niches and new types of products and new types of consumers. And if you're wondering what the picture is, that's an ancient Roman bread brander, and that was compulsory to use, and it was a governance device in the sense that it identified whose bread was whose in communal ovens that were used to make bread, so that individual bakers could get the credit for the quality of their own bread, but it also traced responsibility back to a particular baker if the bread was found to be adulterated or unsafe. So it was a device. Now, in our study, our case studies were the labelling of chicken, pork and ham and egg products, and they're the most intensively confined animals. And in each case, the labelling of those products has become an intensely contested space in which animal advocates, consumers, industry groups, alternative farmer networks, supermarkets and various government agencies have all vied or allied with each other to shape what would appear on the label, particularly in regard to the conditions in which the animals are raised, but also increasingly environmental and public health issues as well. And in the published paper, we argue as to why animal agriculture is a highly significant governance challenge because of the interconnected harms it can and frequently does cause to animals, to public health, such as antimicrobial resistance and zoonotic disease, and to workers and local communities, and also climate and biodiversity impacts. So you can check that out if you're interested. The starting point for the research was the way that civil society groups such as animal advocates, consumer groups, and environmental and public health expert groups regularly call for labelling to address these food system policy challenges. And they do meet with some success in getting action on labelling. It seems to be a neoliberal knee-jerk response. When in doubt about whether you can achieve any other form of regulatory intervention, campaign for mandatory labelling. If you can't get mandated labelling, then call for business to voluntarily label. And this is essentially a regulatory proposition, an attempt to impose an intermediary, the label, that they hope will reconstitute the market and reassert social and ecological concerns over economic interests. Because multiple actors are all contesting how much change is necessary or whether any change is necessary, the label ends up becoming what Fligstein calls a field of struggle. Some might call it a regulatory node, or as I'm framing it today, an intermediary between the various parties who are all seeking to be essentially rule makers rather than rule takers. So the aim of our project was to understand how the politics of how label claims were produced and how they act. So we're interested in what difference, if any, they make to the overall shape of the market and in terms of their action and the ecology of state and non-state regulation that shaped that market. So we tracked egg, pig and chicken products available in Australian supermarkets over time and what they said about animal welfare and other sustainable food system issues. We also tracked public policy and newspaper debate about animal farming issues for the last 30 years to see what difference labels made to policy debates. And we backwards mapped the governance processes and regulatory conflicts over the various label claims using documents and in-depth interviews. And of course, we also looked at production practices associated with them by interviews and site visits. And finally, market, like what it meant for the market, what was sold where, how much. And I should say that how these labels constitute consumers is also important. So consumer research would also be important, but a lot of people are doing that. So we didn't do primary work in that area. And so the methodology is designed to capture how the label is used as a regulatory intermediary in the conflict over the exact contours of the market and of the food system in a sort of Polanyian sense. Moving. So when civil society groups and environmental and health experts call for labelling, they're making a lot of assumptions about how labelling schemes will act on the world. And so in the paper, we try to unpack what these assumptions are by posing a set of hypotheses, asking how would food labelling act if it really were to be transformative in the governance of the food system as hoped, and then marshalling our evidence to summarise whether or not, or to what extent it achieved that in this Australian case. In forming our three hypotheses or questions that are there on the slide, we drew on Parker and Haynes developing theory of ecological regulation, which emphasises that non-human living species and ecosystems are also regulatory actions, that different rules and even regulatory domains interact with each other, and we have to look at them all together as an ecosystem of regulation all the time. And that we also normatively need to bear in mind that humans and all our activity is, including our business activity, is embedded in eco-social systems. So first we hypothesised that, and I'm going to be very brief here, that labelling as transformative government would need to redistribute power away from incumbent actors who benefit from existing practices and towards an ecosystem or diversity of actors, including experts, civil society, alternative entrepreneurs, and even animals and ecosystems. And what our study showed was that labelling did prompt the inclusion of a bigger, more inclusive web of actors in public discourses about the future of animal agriculture. So rather than what's been called the closed community of agriculture departments and agricultural industry that has tended to set standards in the past, we saw consumers, animal advocates, environmental experts, and so on starting to come into the public policy discourse around discussions of labelling of these products. However, this diverse ecosystem of actors ended up largely sidelined by the new labelling schemes that have developed, which largely consolidated a bigger shift of power in the food system from agricultural industries to retailers, and particularly the dominant supermarkets. Second, we argued that labelling as transformative governance would need to accurately represent the identity, provenance, and production processes for food in a way that assists holistic appreciation of where food comes from. And our study found that what happens, of course, is that short labels designed to quickly convey meaning to a consumer are inherently simplistic and misleading, and that this is actually reinforced by the issues-based campaigning of advocacy groups, and then the narrow responses that come back from industry and lack of consumer knowledge. So label claims tend to trumpet small or cosmetic changes and to reductively focus on one aspect of a complex production system. So here you've got an example where it just focuses on sow stalls. Often the focus was on one aspect of the housing system for animals, even though there are many impacts and trade-offs and interconnected issues in animal food production. And the third one was, we argued that labelling as transformative governance would need to prompt citizens not merely to vote with their forks as individuals, but also to move beyond consumption, to further educate themselves on relevant issues, to recruit others, and to create political pressure for transformative change aimed at fellow citizens, businesses, and governance. So individual market action via labels would ideally lead to collective political action to nurture a sustainable, just food system. And so the collectiveness is important there. And our project showed that ongoing contestation about how foods are voluntarily labelled. So the fact that there was a lot of public discussion about what these labels mean and whether they were meaningful or not, it did keep issues alive in public policy discourse. And in particular in Australia, we've seen the debate over whether cages for eggs should be allowed has been very much kept alive because of labelling debates. So that keeps open the policy window for stricter regulation. So there is a translation from individual consumption choices to policy. However, overall, we found that the predominant effect of labelling is to divide consumers into market segments, which we don't think inspires collective action, and also to divide producers into market segments. So there's a mass market where producers undertake small incremental improvements from time to time, and then these market niches with these potentially holistic, accountable standards, but which only sophisticated consumers can access. And this kind of division into market segments is great for capitalism, but it doesn't really put any pressure on large-scale production or government standards to transform the way food is produced and consumed. It simply greenwashes the current productivist, consumptogenic system that's at the heart of the problems. So I'm going to finish up. So in other words, we looked for a transformation of the market via labelling as a regulatory intermediary, but found only a small dint in the boundaries of the market. In the paper, we do make some recommendations about ways labelling might be most strategically used to maximise chances of impact, and we particularly highlight the need for relentless contestation of misleading labelling. But ultimately, we argued that in much of the food policy literature seems to think that we can use labeling and then sort of get a cascade of good stuff happening from labeling. But we argue, however, that labeling is a regulatory intermediary dependent for its effect on multiple other regulatory actors. So the success of the quest for good labeling really depends on the success of the quest for a whole ecosystem of good regulatory governance interventions. And I will hand back the screen. Thanks, David.